When Beijing announced it would restrict the export of crucial rare earth refining technologies and limit shipments of 7 critical rare earth materials, few anticipated just how quickly the tremors would be felt across the global automotive sector. What began as a policy adjustment has evolved into a full-blown supply crisis, one that's forcing multinational corporations to rethink their entire approach to China, and leaving European car manufacturers scrambling to keep their production lines running. Today, companies worldwide find themselves in an unfamiliar position, waiting in line for Beijing's approval to access materials they once took for granted. But not all queues move at the same pace. Nations that have maintained constructive relationships with China are seeing their applications processed relatively smoothly. Those with a history of imposing sanctions or trade barriers, they're discovering that patience is now a mandatory virtue. Nowhere is this new reality more visible than in Europe's automotive heartland. At Stellantis, one of the world's largest car manufacturers, certain European production facilities have ground to a halt. The culprit isn't a labor dispute or a design flaw. It's the absence of rare earth magnets, small but irreplaceable components that power everything from electric motors to advanced sensors. Factory workers who would normally be assembling vehicles now stand idle, their skills temporarily rendered useless by a supply chain bottleneck thousands of miles away. This isn't an isolated incident affecting one company. Across the European Union, automakers are watching their rare earth inventories dwindle to dangerously low levels. The situation became so urgent that just 2 weeks ago, Brussels issued what can only be described as an emergency appeal to Beijing: deliver 100,000 tons of rare earth materials within the next month, or risk watching the continent's entire automotive sector seize up. Stellantis, which operates manufacturing facilities in Serbia, is attempting a different strategy. The company hopes to leverage Serbia's positive diplomatic relationship with Beijing to establish a preferential channel for importing these critical materials. China's response has been measured but revealing. Officials confirmed that export restrictions do exist, but emphasized these measures aren't directed at friendly nations like Serbia. The implication is unmistakable. Countries maintaining adversarial positions toward China shouldn't expect preferential treatment when they come asking for help. This raises 2 pressing questions. First, will Beijing eventually soften its stance and prioritize restoring rare earth supplies to all of Europe, regardless of recent political tensions? And second, just how severe is the crisis facing European automotive manufacturers at this moment? If you're interested in understanding how global economics and geopolitics intersect to reshape entire industries, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss future analysis. Now let's explore how we arrived at this unprecedented situation. The electric revolution that changed everything. To understand today's crisis, we need to rewind nearly a century. During the 1930s, the United States represented the undisputed center of global automotive manufacturing. American brands, Ford, Chevrolet, Buick, weren't just popular domestically. They defined what the world thought a car should be. For decades, this dominance remained largely unchallenged. Then came 2003, and with it, Tesla. This California startup didn't just build electric cars. It reimagined what the automobile could become. Through technological innovation and audacious marketing, Tesla transformed the electric vehicle from a niche curiosity into a desirable product that could compete directly with traditional combustion engines. The company's success inspired a global shift toward electrification. But while Tesla was making headlines in the West, something even more significant was unfolding in China. By 2023, Chinese manufacturers exported 1.203 million new energy vehicles. The following year, that figure climbed to 1.284 million. These weren't just numbers. They represented China's emergence as the world's electric vehicle manufacturing powerhouse. This rapid ascent triggered alarm bells in Washington and Brussels. If Chinese electric vehicles continued gaining market share at this pace, what would happen to domestic manufacturers? Would American and European brands become footnotes in automotive history? The response was swift and aggressive. In May 2024, the United States announced it would raise tariffs on Chinese-made electric vehicles from 25% to 100%, effectively doubling the price and making them economically unviable for most American consumers. It was protectionism in its most transparent form, a wall built not of concrete, but of customs duties. Washington didn't stop there. The U.S. Department of Commerce proposed banning any connected vehicle technology containing Chinese-manufactured hardware or software. The scope was breathtaking. Complete vehicles, individual components, even battery systems. Companies like CATL, which primarily manufactures batteries rather than cars, suddenly found themselves targeted. Some lawmakers suggested adding them to comprehensive blockade lists, further tightening the noose around Chinese participation in the American automotive market. Observing these developments from across the Atlantic, European policymakers decided to follow suit. In July 2024, the European Commission released findings from its anti-subsidy investigation into Chinese electric vehicles and announced temporary tariffs ranging from 17% to 37%, initially set for a 4-month trial period. 3 months later, Brussels escalated further. The European Union declared it would impose tariffs reaching 80% to 100% on Chinese new energy vehicles, with the policy scheduled to remain in effect for 5 years. Combined with American actions, this represented a coordinated Western effort to contain Chinese electric vehicle expansion. Many observers predicted that Chinese manufacturers had been effectively shut out of the world's wealthiest markets. The consensus was clear. Chinese electric vehicles were finished, but predictions, as we're about to see, can be spectacularly wrong. The counterattack nobody expected. Rather than collapsing under the weight of Western tariffs, Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers demonstrated remarkable resilience. In April 2025, BYD, one of China's automotive giants, achieved something unprecedented in the European market. The company sold 7,231 pure electric vehicles that month, representing a 169% increase compared to the same period the previous year. More significantly, this figure surpassed Tesla's European sales of 7,165 units. It was the first time a Chinese manufacturer had outsold Tesla in Europe, directly contradicting the narrative that Chinese brands couldn't compete against established players, even when handicapped by substantial tariffs. The first quarter data painted an even more striking picture. Chinese manufacturers captured 67.7% of the global new energy vehicle market. Think about that for a moment. Of every 3 electric or plug-in hybrid vehicles sold anywhere on Earth, 2 came from Chinese factories. Despite tariffs, despite negative press coverage, despite coordinated efforts to limit their access to Western markets, Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers weren't just surviving, they were dominating. Faced with this unexpected reality, European officials found themselves in an awkward position. Their tariff strategy had failed to protect domestic manufacturers from Chinese competition. But now they faced a different problem entirely. Their own automotive industry was running out of the materials needed to build electric vehicles. Suddenly, the same China they'd been working to exclude from European markets held the key to keeping European factories operational. The irony was impossible to ignore. After months of imposing barriers against Chinese products, Europe now needed to come back to Beijing, not as economic rivals, but as supplicants seeking assistance. The question was whether China would be willing to help. When the assembly lines go silent, it's not always because of a sudden crisis. China's implementation of rare earth export restrictions didn't create immediate chaos, but, the effects accumulated pretty quickly. Production slowdowns began appearing across Europe's manufacturing landscape, and parts suppliers started reporting delays. Assembly lines experienced these intermittent stoppages. By May 2025, the situation had deteriorated significantly. Rare earth inventory levels at numerous European companies had entered the critical zone, what industry insiders call red light status. Without intervention, analysts projected that major production lines would face complete shutdowns within 3 to 4 weeks. This wasn't theoretical anymore. Real factories employing real workers were approaching the point where they simply couldn't continue building vehicles. The electric vehicle sector felt the impact most acutely, which makes sense given how rapidly this industry has grown in recent years. Each electric vehicle requires approximately 1 kilogram of rare earth magnetic materials. That might not sound like much, but these materials are absolutely essential. They're embedded in drive motors, where they help convert electrical energy into mechanical motion with maximum efficiency. They're used in sensors that monitor everything from battery temperature to wheel speed. Here's the critical problem: there are no readily available alternatives. Materials science hasn't yet produced substitutes that can match rare earth magnets in terms of power density, thermal stability, and efficiency. You can't simply swap in a different material and keep building electric vehicles to the same specifications. If rare earth supplies genuinely stop flowing, production stops. Full stop. The implications extend beyond quarterly earnings reports. The European Union has committed to banning the sale of new internal combustion engine vehicles by 2035, an ambitious target meant to address climate change and position Europe as a leader in sustainable transportation. But that entire strategy depends on manufacturers' ability to produce millions of electric vehicles annually. Rare earth shortages threaten to derail this timeline, potentially forcing policymakers to reconsider targets they've presented as non-negotiable. Since April, European automotive suppliers have submitted hundreds of applications requesting export licenses for rare earth materials. The approval rate tells its own story. Roughly 1 in 4 applications receives authorization. The others remain in bureaucratic limbo, neither approved nor definitively rejected. Even when companies successfully navigate the approval process, challenges remain. Chinese customs procedures have become more rigorous, meaning approved shipments can still face delays at ports and border crossings. The result is a supply chain operating at a fraction of its previous efficiency. This bottleneck has created real consequences for Europe's most prominent automotive brands. Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, BMW, names synonymous with German engineering excellence, are all grappling with production constraints tied to rare earth availability. Major suppliers like Bosch, which manufactures electric vehicle motors for multiple automakers, face similar challenges. Some companies have warned that delivery times for certain high-end models could extend by more than 3 months if the shortage continues. There's also the price dimension. Rare earth costs have surged in response to constrained supply, and those increases will inevitably reach consumers. Industry analysts project that if rare earth supply issues remain unresolved through the end of July, average selling prices for new energy vehicles could rise by 8 to 10%. In a market where price competitiveness often determines success or failure, that's a significant handicap for European manufacturers, especially when competing against companies like Tesla and Chinese brands that may have more secure access to materials. European automakers find themselves caught in a perfect storm, trying to compete against well-funded rivals while simultaneously struggling to access the raw materials they need to build vehicles. It's a deeply uncomfortable position for an industry that's long been accustomed to operating from a position of strength. The failed dream of rare earth independence raises some obvious questions. Given these challenges, why didn't Europe develop its own rare earth supply chain years ago? Why allow such critical dependence on a single country? The answer is that Europe did try. European officials weren't blind to the strategic vulnerability created by relying on Chinese rare earth supplies. They developed plans, allocated funding, and announced ambitious targets. But strategy and execution are two very different things. The European Union committed €1.7 billion to support domestic rare earth projects, a substantial sum that was meant to kickstart mining operations, refining facilities, and processing plants across the continent. German automakers, recognizing their particular vulnerability, accelerated partnerships with Australian mining company Lynas Rare Earths, hoping to establish alternative supply channels that could reduce dependence on Chinese sources. These initiatives looked promising on paper. In reality, they've encountered obstacle after obstacle. Building new refining capacity from scratch requires 5 to 10 years, and that's assuming everything proceeds smoothly, with no regulatory delays, no environmental challenges, and no technical setbacks. Meanwhile, Chinese facilities that have been operating for decades continue benefiting from economies of scale and accumulated expertise that European newcomers can't easily replicate. Cost considerations compound these challenges. Chinese rare earth production remains substantially cheaper than European alternatives, not through any single factor, but through the accumulated advantages of mature infrastructure, established supply chains, skilled workforce, and government support. European projects struggle to justify their economics when Chinese competitors can deliver the same materials at lower prices. Some European nations attempted creative alternatives. Romania, for instance, possesses rare earth deposits that initially seemed promising. European mining companies expressed interest, engineering teams conducted assessments, and plans were drafted. But field investigations revealed uncomfortable truths. The reserves were smaller than initially hoped, and extraction costs exceeded Chinese levels by more than threefold. Projects that looked viable during initial planning stages became obviously uneconomical once serious analysis began. But beyond mining lies an even more fundamental challenge. Rare earth processing requires sophisticated chemical and metallurgical infrastructure, entire industrial systems built around specific processes. China has spent decades developing this capability. Europe would need to construct everything from scratch: refineries, processing facilities, chemical treatment plants, waste management systems. Even with unlimited funding, building this infrastructure takes time measured in years, not months. In March 2025, the European Commission unveiled a strategic framework covering 47 critical raw materials, with 14 specifically targeting the rare earth sector. The announced goal was staggeringly ambitious: increase independent rare earth supply capacity fivefold by 2030 and eliminate dependence on Chinese sources. 5 years to accomplish what China built over several decades. The fundamental problem is that European policymakers severely misjudged the complexity of the global rare earth industry. China currently controls approximately 87% of worldwide rare earth processing capacity and 91% of refining capacity. This isn't a monopoly that emerged through aggressive business tactics. It resulted from decades of investment, industrial development, and environmental trade-offs that other countries proved unwilling to make. China's dominance spans the entire value chain, from extracting raw ores from the ground to producing the high-performance magnets that go into electric vehicle motors. No other country possesses this comprehensive capability. Breaking that dependency isn't just a matter of opening mines, it requires rebuilding entire industrial ecosystems. Europe's strategy of following American leads and restricting Chinese electric vehicles while simultaneously pursuing de-Sinicization of supply chains has proven fundamentally flawed. You cannot simultaneously treat a country as an adversary in trade policy and a reliable supplier of critical materials. The current crisis represents the inevitable consequence of that contradiction. Europe comes asking, and well, faced with deteriorating inventory levels and looming production shutdowns, European officials had little choice but to swallow their pride. In June 2025, the European Union's ambassador to China requested formal discussions with Chinese officials, hoping Beijing might expedite the approval process for rare earth export applications and allow more European companies access to desperately needed materials. The tone of these requests revealed how dramatically the power dynamic had shifted. Brussels was no longer dictating terms or issuing demands. Instead, European representatives appealed to Chinese understanding of Europe's predicament, going so far as to request that Beijing produce solutions to the supply crisis within 1 month's time. In exchange for Chinese assistance, European officials hinted at potential future cooperation. Vague suggestions that if China helped Europe through this difficult period, Brussels might consider strengthening the bilateral relationship at some unspecified later date. It was an attempt at leverage by a party that had very little leverage to offer. But instead of receiving the supply commitments they'd hoped for, European officials encountered a very different Chinese response. On July 1, 2025, Beijing announced it would continue imposing anti-dumping duties on stainless steel billets and hot-rolled steel plates from the European Union, the United Kingdom, South Korea, and Indonesia. The tariffs would remain in effect for 5 years. Some observers interpreted this as retaliatory, China using the rare earth crisis as cover to strike back at European trade policies. But this interpretation overlooks important context. The steel duties weren't new, they were continuations of measures first implemented years earlier. Starting in 2019, European stainless steel producers had flooded the Chinese market with products priced below production costs. A textbook example of dumping designed to capture market share through artificially low prices. Chinese steel mills, facing this subsidized competition, watched their profit margins evaporate. Some facilities struggled to remain operational. During this period, the European Union's share of China's stainless steel market surged from 12% to 23%, not through competitive advantage, but through pricing that made long-term business sense for no one except the companies intent on dominating the market. This kind of below-cost selling destroys domestic industries in the target market while providing no sustainable benefit to consumers. When the dumping eventually ends, as it always must, prices rise again, except now domestic competitors have been eliminated. It's a predatory practice that international trade rules explicitly address. Chinese officials had hoped that after several years, European policymakers might acknowledge this behavior and adjust their approach. Instead, when Chinese electric vehicles began gaining global traction, the European Union joined the United States in imposing restrictive tariffs, conducting investigations framed around unfair subsidies, and generally treating Chinese automotive success as a problem to be contained rather than competition to be addressed through innovation. Now, facing a supply crisis, European officials were approaching China with expectations that Beijing would naturally prioritize their needs, and do so on Europe's preferred timeline. The 5-year anti-dumping duty extension served as a pointed reminder trade relationships function on reciprocity, not unilateral obligation. This wasn't punishment for its own sake. It was a message about how international commerce actually works. If you want partnership and cooperation during crises, you can't spend years imposing restrictions, investigating companies, and raising barriers whenever a trading partner becomes too competitive. The rare earth situation is forcing European leaders to confront this reality in very concrete terms. The month that matters is now upon us. Despite these tensions, both sides recognize that finding some resolution serves their interests. China benefits from maintaining strong economic relationships with Europe, while European manufacturers desperately need rare earth supplies to keep their factories running. The coming weeks represent a critical window. At European invitation, a Chinese delegation is scheduled to visit Brussels in July, with additional stops in Germany and France planned. Multiple rounds of high-level discussions will take place, covering not just rare earths, but the broader trade relationship between China and the European Union. These meetings are explicitly designed as preparatory work for a larger summit planned between Chinese and European leaders. Both sides hope to resolve the rare earth supply question before that summit takes place, allowing the leaders' meeting to focus on strategic issues rather than getting bogged down in crisis management. But whether these talks produce the outcomes European officials desperately want depends entirely on what they're willing to offer in return. China has made clear that supply relationships depend on the overall tenor of bilateral relations. Countries maintaining friendly ties receive faster approvals and smoother processes. Those that don't face longer waits and greater scrutiny. Europe finds itself at a crossroads. One path involves acknowledging that its recent trade policies have been counterproductive, that imposing massive tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles while expecting priority access to Chinese rare earth materials was never a sustainable strategy. This would require Brussels to reconsider its approach, perhaps reducing some tariffs, ending certain investigations, and generally treating China more as a partner than a threat. The other path involves continuing current policies, while hoping Beijing will eventually relent and restore rare earth supplies, regardless of European actions. This seems increasingly untenable. China has demonstrated it's willing to enforce export restrictions even when doing so creates diplomatic friction. The country's leadership appears to believe that maintaining control over rare earth supply chains serves long-term strategic interests that outweigh short-term revenue from unrestricted exports. For European automakers, the stakes couldn't be higher. Every week that passes with inadequate rare earth supplies means more production delays, more worker furloughs, and more ground ceded to competitors who don't face the same supply constraints. The transition to electric vehicles, positioned as Europe's automotive future, hangs in the balance.